So we've got a major new development in the nationwide legal fight to dismantle the NFA after the $0 tax change. Now, up to this point, the DOJ has been trying to defend the NFA by arguing that the system still functions properly and that it operates like a permissible regulatory scheme. But the plaintiffs have been pushing back against that issue, showing that there is actual evidence that the ATF is exercising discretion and not running this system like a shall issue permit. But now, the plaintiffs have also taken it a step further. They've brought a brand new Supreme Court decision into this case, and they're using it to argue something much bigger. Not just that the NFA is being applied incorrectly under the Second Amendment, but that it may no longer be constitutional at all based on what the Supreme Court just said. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe. You can also click the like button that just shows the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is First Form. You guys know that First Form's an amazing company. They're pro-freedom, pro-America. They support the Second Amendment and what we talk about here on the channel, but also they have amazing supplements. So if you're trying to get healthier, if you're still on your New Year's resolution, like me, I've been, trying to get healthier, work out more, do all of that. I've already lost 20 plus pounds since the beginning of the year. And a lot of the supplements that I use come from First Form. So if you're interested, you can check them out using the links down below. And right now, if you order any supplements, you will be entered into a random drawing that we're going to do every single month. And if you win that random drawing, you will be entered to win some channel merch, patches, and things like that. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing the NFA challenges that have now been filed in response to the $0 tax change. Now, in this case, the plaintiffs are now pointing to a new Supreme Court 6-3 ruling, which supports one of the main arguments that the plaintiffs have been making in this case all along against the NFA. Now, briefly, let's set the stage for what is going on in this critical case. This case really took off after Congress reduced the NFA tax to $0, and that applies to things like suppressors, SBRs, SBSs, and AOWs. Now, historically, that tax applied to these items like suppressors and SBRs and these other regulated weapons, and the tax wasn't just essentially incidental, it was the entire constitutional foundation for the NFA itself. The NFA was also upheld because it was framed as a tax on these items. But now that tax has effectively been reduced to $0, and the plaintiffs argue that the entire structure of the law has now changed. Because if there is no tax, then what's left actually just looks like less of a tax or this type of tax restriction. It's a lot more like a standalone regulatory system. But now in this case, both sides are trying to win as fast as possible, and they filed for cross motions for summary judgment. The DOJ is arguing that the NFA still survives and continues to operate lawfully, and the plaintiffs are arguing that the registration and restriction system can no longer be justified under the Constitution because there's no longer a tax. Up until now, the fight has mainly been focused on how the law is being applied in practice, whether the ATF is exercising discretion, and if this actually operates as a shall issue system, and whether the system resembles a permissible licensing structure like the Supreme Court talked about in Bruin. But now a new case ruled on by the Supreme Court in a 6-3 ruling has been filed in a supplemental letter to the court here, and in the filing here actually shifts the focus entirely to a different constitutional issue. The plaintiffs have now filed a notice of the supplemental authority bringing in a recent 6-3 ruling by the Supreme Court in a case called Learning Resources versus Trump, which was decided last month, and many of you maybe know about it because that dealt with Trump's tariffs. The plaintiffs in this NFA case are using it to undercut some of the arguments made by the DOJ about why the NFA is still valid despite the $0 tax. Now, in that ruling, the Supreme Court discussed heavily a principle about how Congress operates under the Constitution. The Supreme Court made clear that Congress's power to tax and its power to regulate commerce are separate and distinct. Those two are different sources of authority. And if Congress wants to rely on one of them, it has to do so clearly and explicitly. The Supreme Court emphasized that when Congress writes laws, it does not blend those powers together. It invokes them separately. And that distinction there matters because it limits how far Congress can actually go when creating regulatory systems. Now, this is where the plaintiffs connect that ruling directly to this NFA case. The NFA was enacted under Congress's taxing powers. That's how it was justified, and that's how it's been upheld in the past. But now for many of the firearms at issue, in this case, the tax has been reduced to $0. So the plaintiffs argue that the law is no longer functioning as a tax. Instead, what remains is a system of registration, restrictions, and penalties that operate purely as regulation. And under the Supreme Court's recent ruling, that creates a constitutional problem because you cannot take a law that was justified purely based on taxing powers, remove the tax, and then continue enforcing the regulatory scheme as if nothing ever changed. This leads to the core argument the plaintiffs are making now in this case. They are telling the court here that Congress chose to rely specifically on its taxing power when it enacted the NFA. It did not structure the law as Commerce Clause regulations. And according to the Supreme Court's reasoning in that learning resources case, that choice matters, and it matters a lot. Because if Congress wanted to rely on both of those powers, it would have said so explicitly. It would have made that very clear when they passed the NFA. But the Congress did not do that. They did not say it was based on the taxing powers, the taxing clause, and both also the Commerce Clause. So the plaintiffs argue that once the tax there disappears, the constitutional foundation, which the NFA was founded on, disappears as well. And this is where the argument becomes more significant. The plaintiffs are also saying that the government cannot now go back and try to justify the NFA under the Commerce Clause. They argue that the structure of the statute itself shows that Congress did not rely on that power here in this case. And under the Supreme Court's recent guidance, courts are not supposed to rewrite or reinterpret statutes to find new constitutional justifications after the fact. So there is no fallback for, the DOJ here to say, well, now that the taxing power is gone, we can just rely on the Commerce Clause. There is no sort of alternative basis to keep this system in place once the taxing power and that rationale is gone. This is what makes this new filing so important because it shifts the entire focus of this case. Before, the argument was largely about how the system operates, whether the ATF is applying it correctly, and whether it functions like a permissible licensing scheme. Now the argument is much broader. Even if the system worked perfectly, even if there was no discretion, and even if everything was applied cleanly, the plaintiffs are saying it still would not matter because the law itself has lost its constitutional justification and foundation when it comes to the taxing powers. So stepping back, here's what we now have in this case. We have a tax that has been reduced to $0. We have a regulatory system that is still being enforced, and we have evidence that the ATF is exercising discretion over applications. And now we have a brand new Supreme Court ruling reinforcing that Congress's powers are limited and must be used precisely. All of that together creates a much stronger challenge to the NFA than we've seen before, and this is a new wrinkle to this case where the plaintiffs are pointing to what the Supreme Court just said, and they're pointing to these justifications that the DOJ is trying to use, saying, we'll ignore the taxing powers, look at Commerce Clause. Here they're saying, well, the Supreme Court said you can't do that. So this new supplemental filing is big for this case because the plaintiffs are no longer just arguing that the system is flawed and improperly applied and violates the Second Amendment. They are arguing that the system itself no longer has a valid constitutional basis. And now they're using a recent Supreme Court 6-3 ruling to support that argument. So that's where we currently stand in this critical NFA case after the $0 tax change. As we get more information, as it develops more, as we see the response from the DOJ, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.